Hello everyone. In this mini lesson, we're going to talk about integrating quotes. You'll be able to identify and use 5 strategies for integrating quotes in your documented essay, and by the end of the lesson, you'll understand when each strategy is appropriate in a documented essay. After you finish this lesson, you'll complete a quiz in Canvas. First of all, paraphrasing is, for the most part, much better than using a direct quote, because when you're paraphrasing, you're putting ideas from a reading into your own words, which means that you're integrating those ideas in a more seamless way. And that's why paraphrasing is almost always better than using a direct quote. 90% or more of your essay should be your own words or paraphrases. That means that 10% or less of your essay, it's okay for you to use direct quotes. When you're deciding whether or not to use a direct quote, you can ask yourself these 3 questions. Does it provide additional information that does not simply state the obvious? Does it use language in a unique way? And is it related to the topic of your paper? If the answer to all 3 of these is yes, then that's a sign that you might use a direct quote. You also want to make sure that you're evaluating your sources for credibility and trustworthiness, making sure that you're using recent sources. In the beginning of the semester, I provide sources for you, so you don't necessarily need to think about these questions, but as you're writing your research papers and finding outside sources, keep these things in mind. There are 5 strategies for integrating quotes that we're going to cover in this mini lesson. Using a signal phrase, embedding a quote into a sentence of your own, using brackets, using ellipses, dots, and block quotes. The first strategy is using a signal phrase, and this is the most basic strategy for integrating quotes. This indicates to your reader that you've incorporated information from some other source, and a signal phrase also provides a transition into your quote. So here are some examples of quotes that are introduced with signal phrases. Notice that the signal phrase for this example is at the beginning of the sentence, although you can use a signal phrase at the end of the sentence. It's also worth noting that at the end of the sentence, after the final quotation mark, that indicates that the borrowed words, that you're no longer borrowing words, that you don't have any punctuation, but you do add your parenthetical citation. The page number, which is number 4 right here, that is part of the sentence that the quote is part of, and then the period goes at the end. Here's another example of a quote that is introduced with a signal phrase. You can vary your signal phrases by using different kinds of verbs. Here are some examples of those verbs. And write the author states, claims, explains, illustrates, shows, says, mentions. You can also vary your signal phrases by using different pronouns or words to reference your author. You can write the author, the reading, the article. When you're using a signal phrase or any other quoting strategy that we go over in this lesson, you should always sandwich your quotes. That means that you have a brief explanation before the quote that gives context for the quote, and then after the quote, you explain the meaning of the quote. On the next few slides, you're going to see examples of sandwich quotes. The context or explanation is in green before the quote, and then the meaning of the quote is in blue after the quote. So here's an example of a sandwich quote. The next strategy that we're going to talk about is embedding. This strategy involves selecting a short passage and then blending it into a larger sentence of your own. You don't have to have an entire sentence quote. Okay, your quote can be a fragment or a piece of a sentence, but every quote has to be added and integrated into a larger sentence, and that's what embedding does. So pay attention to the words in orange on the next slide. Here's some examples of embedding. So you'll notice in this first example that you have a piece of a sentence, which is the orange quoted words, and you have the pronoun they that's added to complete this sentence. Now, since we don't have the author's last name in the phrase leading into the quote, we have to add the author's last name in the parenthetical citation. Here's another example of an embedded quote. Here's another example, and another. The third strategy that we're going to talk about is using brackets. You use brackets when you're inserting words of your own, and the words that you're inserting aren't changing the meaning of the words that of your quote. You usually insert words in brackets to either change the verb tense or change a pronoun when you're blending your quote into your own sentence. So what you do is you simply replace the original words with the new words in brackets. Make sure that you're not changing the meaning of the original passage though. So you want to not add in ideas that weren't actually stated. You just want to clarify a reference or change something to make it grammatically correct. So pay attention to the words in purple on the next screens so that you can see examples of quotes that have been clarified by using brackets. So here's the original sentence, and here's the sentence with a word added in brackets. The original sentence, the sentence with brackets. The original sentence, and the sentence with brackets. The fourth strategy that we're going to talk about is ellipsis dots. You use these when you're omitting or getting rid of some words from the original passage. Make sure that you're not leaving out crucial information though. You usually use ellipses only to simplify a passage or to make a quote fit grammatically into your own sentence. So let's look at some examples, and the words in red are the words that have been omitted or left out. So this is the original passage with the words in red left out in the passage with ellipsis. This is the original, and here's the passage with an ellipsis added in and also a word added in brackets. The fifth strategy that we'll look at is block quotes. You should only use block quotes when necessary. A block quote is a quote that's 4 lines or longer. So it's a block of text that you're borrowing word for word from an original reading. Block text should be indented 2 tab lengths, and they don't require quotation marks. It's the formatting that signals that a block quote is a block quote. You usually double space your block quotes like the rest of your paper, and this is very, very important, worth noting. Parenthetical citations come after the period for block quote. This is different than all of the other quoting strategies that we've looked at so far. So here's an example of a block quote. So you'll notice that we do have a signal phrase here to introduce the block quote, but there are no quotation marks. All of the lines are indented by 1/2 inch, and that indentation signals that this is a block quote. Then you'll notice down here that the period is in front of the parenthetical citation. Since we're using a pronoun to refer to the author in the signal phrase before the quote, we have to add the author's last name in the parenthetical citation after the block quote. So this quoting strategy is formatted differently than the other quotes. That's how you're signaling to your reader that it is in fact a block quote. In addition, it's 4 lines or longer, so it's a long string of text. So it's important that you're signaling that in a different way. And again, use block quotes sparingly in your own writing. Here are some additional tips and guidelines for integrating quotes. Avoid using a quote as a topic sentence. A quote is rarely, if ever, an effective topic sentence in an essay. And since we're mainly writing argument-based essays in this class, you're not going to have a quote as a topic sentence within the body of your essay. Quotes should be used to illustrate a point or support a point within your body paragraphs. Provide follow-up explanations after every quote. So use them to support your ideas, but you must explain what they mean and interpret their significance. So don't just drop a quote into a paper as a concluding sentence in a body paragraph, or add in a quote and then add a quote right after it. A quote has to be sandwiched. So there should be a signal phrase before a quote, regardless of the kind of quote that you're using, or you should embed that quote into a larger sentence. And then after it, you explain what the quote means. So two quotes are not going to be right next to each other ever. You should be selective and don't overquote in your essay. Avoid using more than one quote per paragraph if possible. As I mentioned before, paraphrasing is much more effective at integrating borrowed information. So it's okay if you have a paragraph where you don't have any direct quotes and you only have paraphrased information, but you don't want to use quotes have multiple quotes in a paragraph. You want to quote sparingly. Quotes should only be used to back up your points. So what that means is you make a point and then you use a quote as evidence to back it up. And then you explain how that quote proves the evidence or proves the point that you were trying to make in the first place. Okay? Paraphrasing and summarizing ideas is better than quoting, as I've mentioned before. So now that you have all of this information to help you use and integrate quotes correctly in your own writing, now you're going to take the quiz in Canvas. And if you have any questions, feel free to message me or email me, give me a call. I will get back to you as soon as possible. There's also a help function in Canvas. If you scroll to the bottom of the quiz, you can see that there are links to some frequently asked questions. You can click on those links to get additional guidance about completing a quiz in Canvas, how to upload an assignment through a quiz, or if you can go to the Canvas student guide if you want an immediate answer on some aspect of taking or completing this quiz that's not answered there. So go ahead and log into Canvas and get started on your quiz.